right, so my name is Chelsea Baird and I'm the horticulturalist for the town of Amherst. Allison asked me to speak about some spring gardening. Um, and wow, it's cold out there today. You would think that spring was near by what we had on the weekend, but now we've shifted to cold again. Welcome to Nova Scotia. But in saying that, now is the time to think about getting ready to plant your seeds. I know this is something that gardeners are pretty eager about, is getting their seeds started. And usually what takes place is they are a little bit overzealous and they like to plant them a little too early. And then they come to me and say, why are my seedlings so laggy? My seedlings are falling over. What's happening? Much like what Will just said, they need water and most of all, they need light. Can you hear me okay, Allison?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll get started. So when it comes to gardening, I have to say my number one tip to everybody is to plan. The old saying, fail to plan, plan to fail, is kind of how it works with gardening as well. I mean, some people get by pretty easy and they can kind of throw things in willy-nilly and it grows. However, for most people, that's not the case. So when we talk about going from seed to garden, I'm just going to kind of go over a few tips on from the very beginning until the end. So um, I would have to say that, you know, the first thing that we need to focus on is definitely getting the timing right. So when we want to start our seeds earlier, that means that we want to have them ready to go outside once the weather is favorable. And definitely one of the best ways to do this and to set yourself up so that you avoid those laggy seedlings and having to start all over again is to make sure that you're not starting your seeds too early. So generally when you get a seed pack, which this one is from Bessie's, cucamelons are one of my absolute favorite things to grow. It will say on the back or on the front, depends on which brand you choose to go with, when these should be planted. So some will either say direct sow, which means that you're going to put them directly into your garden, and some will say to start generally before 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. And if you're in Nova Scotia, you know that our last frost seems to be forever changing. But the old saying, planting after the new moon in June, is kind of tried and true, really. I mean, it's funny because it spans decades, and yet it still seems to be how we can judge when we should put our plants in the ground. So by doing that 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost, you should be ready to transplant out into the ground. Now, like I said, some typically say that they're direct sow. So those are some of your types of vegetables like your beans, your squash, your root vegetables, your carrots, which are actually best started outdoors. They can be started inside, but you're probably going to struggle a little bit with them and they'll end up pretty laggy. And obviously with different things like peas or cucumbers, they really need something to grow up. So there's really little benefit to growing those ones indoors. They germinate very quickly and they grow very quickly, and then you're left with plants that are ready to go in the ground, but we're still a month or two out of planting them into the ground. Finding the right containers. So once you have your times figured out and you know what you want to put into the ground, and that you have adequate space for what you're growing, you'll want to find the right container. So you want to start the seeds in anything. If you're a DIY type person, you can use yogurt cups, milk cartons, paper cups, toilet paper tubes. Just a warning, they turn very mushy by the end of the time that it's time to transplant them. The most important thing when you're choosing your containers to grow in is definitely that you have drainage holes to avoid having your roots rot. So there's a number of different things that you can choose. Personally, I actually prefer to use these plastic cells, just because they already come with the holes perforated in the bottom. They fit easily into the trays. The trays are easy to move around, and they're very easy to water, and any excess water collects in the bottom of the tray. And nowadays, they even have trays that come with a mat in the bottom of them, which will soak up the water. They're self-watering, and then once the plant needs it, once the soil dries out and the plant needs it, it will uptake the water from that mat. So those are also pretty cool to see now coming out on in the industry. So once you've kind of chosen what you're going to plant them in, it's time to choose your potting soil. So there are a number of different potting soils out there on the market. ProMix is definitely one of the better ones. I will give a little warning, Miracle Grow, please don't come after me, but I know that the Miracle Grow that is very common that you see at Walmart and other retailers often comes with fungus gnats. So if you've ever bought a bag of potting soil and you take it home, you plant up your house plants, and then all of a sudden you see these little black flies flying about, generally that came from your soil. I mean, there's a number of other things that it could have come from, but if you've changed your potting soil, and I mean, unfortunately, I hate to point fingers at a brand, but it's Miracle Grow that I generally see that with. So just be careful when you're picking your potting soil. You want to make sure that you have fresh, sterile mix that's free from any diseases or pests. And you want to avoid using soil from your garden and reusing any potting soil from your house plants. The reason why you want to stay away from using garden soil to start your seeds with indoors is because it's heavy, and generally it's hard for the seed to germinate through that. Before filling your containers, if you pour your soil and any additives that you might want to put into your soil into a bucket or a tub, a wheelbarrow. Generally, I use a wheelbarrow because generally I'm mixing a lot of soil at once. You want to make sure that you moisten it. The goal is definitely to get it moist, but not sopping wet. You want it to be kind of like crumbly, not like mud cakes. Then once you're ready, you fill the containers and you pack the soil firmly to eliminate any gaps. This is kind of something that's pretty key in all container gardening, is using the moist soil at the time of planting, as well as kind of packing it down a bit. If you don't do that, what happens is once you thoroughly water it, then the soil will kind of drop and you'll be, 6 inches from the top of your pot when you want to be more 2 inches closer to the top of your pot. And just remember that a lot of mixes don't contain any nutrients in them or few nutrients. So you'll need to feed your seedlings with a liquid fertilizer. Generally with vegetables, I prefer to use an organic fertilizer. A few weeks after they germinate and right up until they're going to be transplanted into the garden. So once we have our soil firmly into our containers, whatever our container of choice was, we can start planting. So once we start planting, you're going to want to first check the seed packet to see how deep you should plant your seeds. Kind of rule of thumb is the smaller the seed, the less soil that's going to go on top of it. So if you have a bigger seed, you're going to want to plant it a bit deeper, and you're going to want to make sure that whichever container you're using, that it's at least 2 to 3 inches deep. That's generally kind of how deep they actually come. You don't want it to be too deep at all, or it'll take quite a while for your seedling to eventually find the sunlight or artificial light, whatever light it is that it's working with. And generally, when it comes to planting in cells or pots, I generally put 2 or 3 seeds per hole. And then that way, if both seeds germinate, I just snip one off and let the other one grow. Or depending on what it is, I might eat it because microgreens, delicious. So it's when you're ready to plant into the soil, something as easy as a pencil to poke a hole down into the soil, make a divot to drop your seed into, and then just cover your seed back up with the soil. They also make little planting tools, which are pretty much a plastic stick that you just dip into it and then drop your seed down into it. Then once your seeds are planted, you're going to want to moisten the soil. So remember that your soil is already moistened. So you just want to lightly kind of mist it so the top of the soil is a bit moist. Um, you don't want it to be soaking wet at all. And then one of the options that you have is a lot of these pots, these containers come with a little lid, which kind of makes your own greenhouse. Um, the other option is if you choose to kind of go the DIY method, you can use anything like a plastic dome, which I know you can get at the dollar store. You could use plastic wrap, anything that kind of contains that moisture and helps keep the seeds good and happy until they sprout. And then once they sprout, you'll want to remove the cover. Um, Another thing that I should mention is when I start all of my seeds, I start with a warming mash. So this just goes underneath the tray and it provides heat to the bottom of the tray and makes kind of a healthy, warm, cozy little area for the seeds to germinate. Generally, you're going to have quicker germination if you have heat and moisture. So, and you can pick those up anywhere. I mean, any kind of big box store sells them, as well as the co-ops, Suregain. Those places also have the seedling mats. So once you have that kind of all in place and your setup is good to go, then you can use a mister and gently wet down your soil, and just remember to kind of let your soil dry slightly between waterings. You don't want it to be, like I've said a million times already, you don't want it to be sopping wet because there will be little to no oxygen for your plants to grow. It's great to set up a fan to ensure like you have air movement, which makes your seedlings much stronger. So if you have kind of your setup, having a fan nearby to move the air about will really help to prevent disease. And also just remember to feed your seedlings with the liquid fertilizer throughout once you've planted them until transplant stage. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the most important factors in seedlings is light. You definitely need to have light for them to grow. So if you're growing in a window, choose a south-facing exposure window. That way you get more sun throughout the day. And don't forget to rotate your pots. So that the plants aren't always leaning towards the light. As you rotate them, you make sure that it's strong all around the stem and not just on one side of the seedling. And if your seedlings don't get enough light, they definitely will become laggy and will be quite weak. If you are growing under light, so this is just kind of a simple light that goes over top of my tray. If you're choosing to grow over a light, you want to make sure that the light is just a few inches above the tops of the seedlings. So generally when you buy one of these, it doesn't measure up to that. So what I do is I just put boxes or blocks of wood and raise it up so that it's at least 2 to 3 inches underneath the lights, so the plants don't have to stretch to try and get that light. And generally, you want to keep them under the lights for 15 to 18 hours. There's timers out there now that you can get that are set so that it will be on for however many hours you choose. But also remember that, plants are just like humans. They also need time to rest. So they also need that darkness as well. And as your seedlings get bigger and bigger, you want to raise your lights so they're a bit farther away from the seedlings so they grow strong stems. So that sounds easy. Yep, you plant the seed, you water it, you give it light, and away we go. Another common mistake that I see is that, especially in new gardeners, is that they take I have all my seedlings, they're beautiful, they're nice and thick, they're ready to go, and then they plant them in the garden. So they're in shock. So you can think of, we've coddled, we've protected these little seedlings in our house that is nice and warm, hasn't been exposed to sunlight, hasn't been exposed to any great wind, although we are providing a bit of air circulation with a fan. It's not near, the northeastern winds that we have, or the southwestern winds that come along. We want to keep them kind of protected for a bit longer. So we gradually want to introduce them into the outdoor atmosphere. So recommended is that for 7 to 10 days before you're ready to plant, you would take them outside, put them in a protected area, somewhere where there's like light shade, not exposed to winds, and then put them out for a few hours at a time and gradually increase that amount of time. And then always remember to bring them in at night. We don't want to lose them to a potential frost. And then as you get closer to the end of that week of hardening off your plants, is what we call it, then you want to expose them to a bit more sunshine and a bit more wind. I can tell you from personal experience, when you get lazy and you're tired of moving them in and out and in and out, especially when you have trays and trays and trays of them, one, they get sunburnt and the leaves are almost translucent or brown. And the same thing happens with the wind. So you really want to make sure that you take the proper time to harden off any of your transplants before actually putting them into the ground. And if you have a cold frame, even better, because they're going to be protected from the sun and the wind. But just remember to move them out for a couple days before actually transplanting them into the ground. So I guess once your plants are hardened off and it's time to plant them into the ground, it's time to get growing.
Do you keep feeding them fertilizer up until they start to flower in the ground? Because that's what I've always been told. But yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, with any plant, the number one thing that you have to ensure is that your soil is healthy. Mm-hmm. The soil is the foundation, so you want to make sure that even before you put your plants in the ground, that you've amended it with compost, something that's going to provide nutrients to your plants, and using some type of fertilizer. Like generally, you can use whatever fertilizer you prefer. It's really up to you, but generally with vegetables, I prefer to use like an organic type fertilizer. Just to kind of keep it a little bit cleaner than commercial fertilizers, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. So that's pretty much all that I had. Yeah. Any other questions?
I always start my seeds too early. I think.
A lot of people do.
But my house is quite cold, so I find they always take a long time to sprout, especially herbs. I find my herbs take forever, like dill.
Yeah, well, it generally does take longer to germinate. Do you use anything like a heating mat?
No, I've done everything wrong. I just put it into packs and put them by the sun and then water them occasionally.
That's the beauty of gardening, though.
Yes.
You get it's all about trial and error. Like, the mistakes that you make are what you learn from. And I still make the same mistakes.
And once I had a cover for all my seedlings, and then they all molded somehow, so I didn't have enough air circulation. I must have.
Yeah, so they didn't have enough, and the problem is that probably when you put that top onto it, your soil was too wet to begin with. Right, so it never had the opportunity to dry out. And that's one good thing too about having a heat mat, is that it does dry out the soil a bit better than as if it's just in a dome and there's no air circulation at all.
So are the heat mats just like a piece of black foam, or does it actually have?
No, it's a piece of plastic. It's a piece of plastic, and then inside it's got heaters that kind of like a
okay,
like a thing that runs kind of up and down, that you just, once you plug it in, it heats up, kind of like a heating pad,
like a heating, yeah.
And they're relatively cheap. Like I don't even remember, because it was a long time ago that I bought that one, but I have a few of them that I use, that I put under them. So there's a lot of cheap options out there. I think I got that generally from Canadian Tire, maybe.
Right.
Yeah. Have you started your plants yet?
I have not.
Good girl.
Yeah.
I know.
I started looking at the seed catalogs and making a plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those seed catalogs get you. Then you're like me, and I don't know where my seed catalog book is, but you end up with a binder filled with every vegetable and flower you could imagine. That my husband says, "Do you really need more seed?"
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
And it's always like, oh, I want to try these like purple carrots this year. Like,
yes, exactly. Then they're always coming out with new and improved vegetables and flowers and.
Yeah. Do you have any tricks on how to keep cats away? So I have raised beds, and cats like to use it to dig in. Is there any other, like, I tried the string and stuff when I planted the beans and peas to start, but is there anything else? Like, I don't want to hurt the cat.
Yes, you probably don't want to hurt the cat. Yes. I don't actually have any tricks. I also have the same problem, and it's my neighbor's cat.
Right.
And what I do is I literally run strings around my bed so that it's kind of covered. We also have deer, so we kind of have to take those precautions to keep them out. I mean, I'm happy that they're coming to graze in my yard, but yes, I know the struggle all too well of having cats in your gardens.
Yeah. So the string, I guess we'll just keep doing that.
Yeah, and like usually if you have something in there that moves as well, it kind of helps. So like even if you put I was gonna say plastic bags, but we don't have those anymore. You could use like a flagging tape or something that kind of moves in the wind, the same way that you kind of use tin plates for birds. Sometimes if there's something that makes a noise, it'll kind of startle the cats to get out of there. That's kind of what I've always used, but it's kind of an ongoing battle.
Yeah. Jerry, do you have any questions?
No, this was really helpful. I enjoyed it. I love to plant seeds. I love to get started. I ordered some seed from Halifax Seed. So I'm looking forward to that. But there were some really good tips there that I wasn't aware of. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad that you could take something away from it. It's funny because it's just kind of like second nature to me. So I just think that I'm like, oh God, I'm really going to bore everybody with this.
No, there were some very good tips. Yes.
Yeah, so there's just kind of ways to make it a bit easier on yourself. And I mean, it's funny because I say this often, you know, my aunt will call me and say, I have this problem, and I offer up a solution, and she's like, okay, yeah, okay, I'll try that. And then I'm like, oh, did you try that? No. I'm like, no. Okay. Okay. Maybe I'm not the best at delivering advice.
It was a good delivery.
Thank you. What's not to love, really? I mean, thinking forward to, you know, seeing some flowers and eating fresh vegetables and fruit.
Yep.
It's coming. It's coming.
Yes. What are those? You said you like growing the cucumelons?
Cucamelons.
Cucamelons.
Yeah.
What are they? What do those taste like?
So they kind of taste like citrusy cucumber, like a bit limey. They're like little snack size. Did I do with the pack? They're like the size. They're probably about like this big. I mean, they can get bigger. They grow on a vine and they're very foliferous. Like there's all kinds of them on a plant. I actually grow them in a planter on my deck. And then that way my kids just go out and go crazy over them. It looks like it's the neatest thing. It's native to Mexico. It looks like a watermelon. It looks like the tiniest little watermelon. It definitely has that kind of texture of biting into a cucumber and that cucumbery flavor with a little bit of like a citrus twist on it. They're delicious.
Those sound amazing.
And
they're not like I've tried to grow cantaloupe and it kind of works.
Our season
if we have a really hot summer. But
our season isn't long enough for watermelons, cantaloupes. Not that you can't grow them, you definitely can, but those have to be started in advance. And a lot of the time, we don't have the length of heat that those need consecutively. Like, I mean, you look at last July, it rained how many days out of the month? Like, cantaloupes, watermelons, those type of things don't love that weather. They want it to be hot and dry. Cucamelons, they could care less. They didn't do as well last summer as they've done in previous summers, but I still had way more than I could eat. Like I was always going somewhere with a bag of them to give them away.
All right. I got like those 99-cent discount, like a Superstore mid-July. I think it was 2 years ago. I got melons. So I just threw them in the ground for fun. And I got like the tiniest little melon. Yeah. But we had a really hot, dry summer. So that helped.
And in order to kind of keep those things going so that they're kept warmer longer, so that they have more of an extension on the growing season, you can always cover them up with something like a dome or like a row cover to keep them going a bit longer. Actually, like I feel like anytime that we've grown watermelon, they actually taste better after a frost. They sweeten up a lot more, kind of like grapes do. That like they'll sweeten up after a frost too, and I guess that's just the breakdown of sugars in the plant. But yeah,
right.
I'll guarantee that you will enjoy the cucamelon.
Yeah, I need to get some of those.
Yeah, they're delicious.
Yeah.
What's the secret to watering tomatoes?
The secret to watering tomatoes. Wow, that's an interesting question. tomatoes don't like to dry out. And actually, a planting tip for tomatoes is I take my eggshells and I bake them in the oven, actually. So I take them, I bake them in the oven, I crush them all up, and I put them in planting holes. In the planting holes with my tomatoes and my peppers, because those are two things that, if you've had issues with tomatoes, it was probably one, they got blossom end rot, which means the bottom of the tomato starts to rot even on the plant. And or two, the same thing kind of happens with a pepper as well. And by putting the eggshells in your planting hole, it slowly breaks down and it releases calcium into the plants, which is generally the cause of blossom end rot, is a deficiency in calcium along with other things. However, also a large part of that is improper watering of your plants. So when your fruit are on the plant and they're getting bigger and bigger, that's the time that water is the most important. So you want to make sure that you keep them well watered, because you'll see that if you don't, the first thing that the plant will start to take water from is your fruit. So that's why you'll see them kind of, or your vegetable, that's why you'll see them get a bit smaller. Or you think of a cucumber and it's growing beautifully nice and long, and then all of a sudden it goes skinny, 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 skinny. So it starts to kind of lose that water. As far as the like watering tomatoes, it would be the same as watering anything else. You want to make sure that you give them adequate moisture, and generally in the summer you want to water them earlier in the morning and try to avoid those kind of later evening waterings. Because generally, I mean, think about yourself. When you wake up in the morning, generally you need a drink of water. If you're somebody who drinks water, I personally, the first thing I have to do in the morning is drink water. So you want that water first thing in the morning, because you've been sleeping all night. So same as a plant. The plant wants a drink first thing in the morning so that it can start its day off right and go into the day. Because when it hits 35 degrees in the heat of the summer, if that plant doesn't have moisture first thing in the morning, it's going to be hurting all throughout the day, the same way a human would be.
Okay.
What seems to be the issue with the watering of the tomatoes? Do you just find that they dry out really quickly?
Yes.
Or,
it's a full-time job. I don't have a lot of tomatoes and I do them in containers, but last summer I was just water all the time. They grew nicely, but I thought, well, maybe there's something I should put in with the soil that would help maintain that moisture for a bit longer. And I was watering them at night.
So once you put them into your container, so we're kind of moving away from seedlings into actually transplanting them into a container. When you do that, you want to make sure that you're not only using potting soil, you also want to mix compost into it at the same time. Okay. So that's key, is because the potting mix that you generally buy is like a soilless growing medium. It's made out of a peat moss, generally has perlite in it, the white kind of chunks that you see. And the reason why potting soil is so great is because there's a reduction, like you have vacant airspace so that the water can kind of move throughout and around the roots. Now, once you plant that out in either like in ground or into a container, you want to make sure that you add that compost to heavy it up a bit. So you think of garden soil, generally around here we have clay soil, so it's pretty heavy. We need to really get the compost into it, lighten it up. And if you're doing it in containers, which I actually grow tiny Tims generally in containers, just to have on the deck, you want to make sure that when you do your mix, that you use a good potting soil. So generally I do use Pro Mix.
All I use.
I use Sunshine Mix too. You can get both of them from Sure Gain. I think maybe Canadian Tire now carries sunshine as well. As long as it has some sort of base, like a peat moss. It has perlite in there for aeration. A lot of them have wetting agents in them now. So that means that they kind of soak up the soil and soak up the water, sorry, and hold it in the soil a bit longer until there's a demand by the plant to uptake that water. And then generally there's a lime or something else that's in those kind of growing mixes, so that it's continually providing. And if I'm going to mix those up, I generally add into my bag of Pro Mix, I would have a bag of compost, and then also I like to add my fertilizer into it as well. So just a granular fertilizer that'll break down over time, so that there's nutrients in the soil continually, versus just providing it through Miracle Grow or whatever your liquid fertilizer is that you like to use on your plants. And then I wish I had a package. I don't right now. Trying to think of where one would be. In my flower containers, I always use something called Soil Moist, and you can actually get it at Canadian Tire and Amherst. I usually buy them out every year. It's kind of like the gel that's in a diaper. And yes, I've used diapers in my planters as well, like rip them open and kind of put the stuff in it, because what it does is it swells up with the water. And then same thing, once the plant needs that water, it's sucked out of that crystal and is dispersed into the soil, and the plant uptakes it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have so many notes.
Soil Moist saves my life when it comes to containers and watering them all the time.
Yes.
They dry out so fast.
And that's the thing too, is like when you pick a container to put something in, the bigger the better, because there's more area that water can be held. You go to somewheres and you buy like the little 8-inch, 10-inch hang baskets, or the small deck planters, and it's like, okay, I just watered this morning, I have to water it again. And if you're like me and you can't go home at lunchtime to water your plants, usually some days I come home and my plants are pretty sad, but they rebound quickly. And that's why I like having all those nutrients in the soil is key, is because if your plants kind of are lacking water, they have that strength that's been given to them by the nutrients that you've put into the soil.
Thank you.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up unless you have any more questions.
No, that was great.
I think I could talk about plants all day. Mostly about all the problems I've had.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
a common conversation with me and people.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.